Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everybody.
Thanking the Basque authorities for having invited the European institutions to contribute to this event, and also to congratulate you for the capacity to bring all these people together from all over the world to talk about vocational education and training. My name is Joao Santos. I'm Portuguese nationality, so Iberian, like most of the people around here today. I've been working for the European Commission for quite some years. The last 4 years I've been at the EU delegation to China, so I think I'm somehow an example of the diversity and the various transitions that we have to go throughout our life. So I've been working as a diplomat in China dealing with trade issues. I'm now working with education and training. I worked for some years in research and development, and I think that most of us can also identify in the sense that today I think the education systems have to have the capability not only of providing us with the skills to work tomorrow, but also with transversal skills that will allow us to manage the various transitions we have throughout our lives. Today I would like to share with you three ideas and information on three topics that we are dealing with in Europe. The first one is to give you a brief overview of how we conduct vocational education and training policy at the European Union level. Then I'd like to briefly tell you how we in DG Education and Culture are helping to finance reforms and mobility throughout Europe with the Erasmus Plus program. And then I will end with an overview of what we are doing and why we are incentivizing the member states to develop European Alliance for Apprenticeships. First of all, I'd like to tell you that very much like our American friends yesterday, at the European central level, we don't have much power to tell the member states what to do. I don't think we have the capacity to tell you what to do because you know much better. You are closer to the people, you are closer to business, you know much better what you have to do. What we try to do at the European level is to share experiences and try to, through dialogue, speak with the member states and try to identify what could be the key objectives for vocational education and training, and therefore mobilize reforms throughout Europe. We have a legal basis in the treaty, which is this Article 165 and 166, which gives us some reference to what we should be doing together with the member states for vocational education and training policy. This then is materialized through the Copenhagen Process. I don't know if you've heard of it, but since 2010, we've been trying, since the year 2000, we've been trying to mobilize reforms in vocational education and training in Europe through what we call the Copenhagen Process. Basically, what we do is we set long-term objectives, and then we work together with the member states, coming up with tools, coming up with peer reviews, so that we can mobilize all the stakeholders to conduct reforms in vocational education and training. The social partners have a very, very important role in this process. And we also rely on the work of two agencies. We have this agency which is called CEDEFOP, which you might have heard about. It's based in Thessalonica, in Greece, which acts as a sort of a think tank and conducts research and investigation in order to understand better what is happening not only in Europe in vocational education and training, but also throughout the world, and try to bring these good experiences to our policy making in the European Union. We have another agency which is the European Training Foundation, which basically cares about our external action, mainly with the southern Mediterranean countries, with the Eastern European and the Central Asian countries. So we are through technical assistance and expertise, helping these countries to develop skills and human capital. And then you might also be aware that we have Europe Aid, which is a Director General within the European Commission, which is in fact, as far as I know, and recent studies have shown, the biggest donor of foreign aid. So we're talking about in Africa, in Asia, in South America. We are the biggest donors of aid for reforms in vocational education training throughout the world. So here we're not talking about coordinating education training policies within Europe, but what we are doing throughout the world, because we recognize the importance of having skilled and qualified people in developing countries in order to contribute to the development of those countries. So as I said, the Copenhagen Process, which is a sort of the framework within which we coordinate vocational education and training policies in Europe, acts at 4 levels. There's a political process in which not only the 28 member states, but also the members of the European Economic Area, so this includes Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. We work together with them and the candidate countries, so Turkey is also part of it, in which we define what are the big strategic objectives for reforms in education and training in Europe. Then we have a second level of action, which we call the developing common tools, in which I'm sure you might have heard of the European Qualification Framework. You might have heard of ECVET, which is a credit system for vocational training to help mobility throughout Europe, and also the ECAVET, which is a quality assurance framework for VET. These are examples of tools that we build at the European level, and then the various member states, training institutes use as a way to integrate and create a European space for vocational education and training. Of course, we also use fostering mutual learning, and we do this through various ways. We do it through peer learning activities, we conduct studies, we share ideas. We have, in fact, next week in Brussels, the Advisory Committee for Vocational Training, in which we bring all the member states together, and we will be discussing what will be the future priorities for vocational education and training up to 2020. The involvement of all the stakeholders, I would like to emphasize as one of the important parts of what we do. We have the social partners very much as part of the process. We have also the VET providers. There are quite a few VET provider associations in Europe. We also bring them together to cooperate in this process. The Copenhagen process, as I said, is usually updated through things that we call communiques. The last communique we had was in 2010 in Bruges. That's why it's called the Bruges Communique, which basically sets a vision for vocational education and training up to 2020. It has 11 strategic objectives. I'll not bore you with all the objectives, but you know, it highlights the usual traditional issues in VET, which are, you know, attractiveness, excellence, flexible access to vocational education and training, and among the various education sectors. And although we have a strategic vision for the future, we usually act on the basis of short-term deliverables. The deliverables we are working on right now is the period 2011-2014, and we are now preparing the deliverables for the period 2015-2017. But what I'd like to emphasize is that this is not, you know, some bureaucrats in Brussels that come up with the ideas, but it is very much a participative process in which we engage with the member states, with the social partners, and we come up with what we think are common objectives that we should all be working on. There's a very important governance process in all this to make sure that we have the right mechanisms to coordinate what we do in Europe. And this is done basically through the coordination and advisory bodies that we have. The Directors General for Vocational Education and Training of all the 28 member states meet on a regular basis, at least twice a year. And we have the Advisory Committee on Vocational Training that I was just telling you is going to meet in Brussels next week. We have, as I already mentioned before, 2 important agencies to help us implement vocational education and training policy, CEDEFOP and the European Training Foundation. The next steps in the Copenhagen process is the Bruges review, which is going to take place in 2015. In September this year, CEDEFOP will come up with a report which monitors VET throughout the whole of the European Union. They will tell us what has been the progress in the last few years, and then we're going to identify where gaps still exist, and then come up with objectives for reviewed objectives for 2020. In 2015, as I said, we'll come up with the new priorities. It is very important to say that, as you know, last weekend we had European elections. There's a very big change process that is going to take place in the next few months until the beginning of 2015. We'll have a new president of the European Commission, we'll have a new president of the European Parliament, we'll have a new president of the European Council, and of course these people will come with new ideas. There will be some refining of what we call the Europe 2020 strategy, of what we have as the European Education and Training 2020 strategy, and of course this will have implications on what we are doing with the Copenhagen process and VET reforms throughout Europe. Just very briefly, I'd like to tell you that we are now also conducting a study at the European level on mapping what member states are doing in terms of VET internationalization. And here I don't mean what Spain is doing with Portugal or Spain doing with France, but what the various member states in Europe are doing in cooperation with other countries of the world. And we've, in the preliminary study, as I said, the study will only be ready by December 2014, but there are some preliminary conclusions that we have. First of all is that the VET cooperation with third countries is done at a strategic level, where you have governments, for example, the Spanish government might have cooperation with some countries in South America, where you are working on vocational education and training. You might even have some mobility programs with, with other countries. And there's a different level which doesn't go from government to government, but from VET institutions to VET institutions. You have, for example, the Basque country and some of the institutes in the Basque country cooperating with other institutes throughout the world. There's also some mobility programs taking place without the need of any EU funding. You are doing it yourselves in Europe. We've identified in this study. And of course, some countries like Germany are establishing VET institutes in third countries. Some of the times they do this not only because as terms of cooperation with third countries, but also because European companies establishing themselves in India, in China, in many countries, sometimes find difficulties in recruiting qualified people. So European countries are themselves establishing VET centers in those countries to make sure that they will have the qualified people that they need. I'm not going to go through this. These slides are going to be distributed to everyone, so I'm not going to go into detail with all of them. But these are just some examples of some of the results of the mapping work that we have been doing. We've seen that, for example, Germany is establishing VET providers in many countries. There's strong cooperation between the US and Denmark on VET as well. Austria has quite a few programs running with some Asian and Central Asian countries as well. And you even have we've identified some instances where we have mutual recognition of qualifications between European countries and some Asian countries, which is quite remarkable because it shows you that we can learn from these experiences, because in Europe sometimes we have difficulties in having mutual recognition of qualifications. However, some countries are doing it with third countries. But as I told you, this is a study that will be published by the end of this year, which I think can be useful for us to establish internationalization strategy at the European level to support what the various institutes are doing throughout Europe. Now, very quickly on Erasmus and how it is supporting vocational education and training. I'm sure most of you have heard Erasmus, but you usually relate it to higher education. A lot of people have done Erasmus exchange programs, but we also do it in vocational education and training. I can tell you in the last programming period, we had more than 400,000 students in Europe financed by European funds for Erasmus. The current program of Erasmus Plus was adopted in 2013, so just a few months ago, and the first call for proposals was in the 12th of December 2013, and in this year we'll start using the funding available. Very quickly, we have just in Erasmus, so European money to support mobility and education reforms in the various European countries. We have something like a budget of 14.7 billion euros. So this, for our American friends, is about 19 billion US dollars that we are providing to support mobility and reforms in VET. We have more money besides this, and my colleague from DG Employment will then, that will speak after me, he's responsible for a significant amount of money, the European Social Fund, which also supports reforms of vocational education and training, not only on vocational education and training, and they even have a bigger pocket of money to support these reforms. But the Erasmus has 14.7 billion. Very quickly, we intend to support mobility of up to 4 million European students and teachers throughout Europe in the next few years. In higher education, there will be 2 million students. For vocational education and training, 650,000 students will be supported by Erasmus in the next few years. And not only students, but staff mobility, because of course teachers, exposing teachers to experiences in other countries is extremely important to open them to the world and to then bring new ideas into the vocational institutes where they are working. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of this, but just give you a brief idea of how Europe, with financial support, is mobilizing efforts to reform VET systems throughout Europe. Of the Erasmus program, not all of it is for VET, of course, the 14.7 billion. We have for higher education, 43% of this money goes to higher education, so that's where the bulk, that's why most people usually associate Erasmus with higher education mobility through university mobility. But 22% goes for vocational education and training, 15% for schools, and 5% for adult education. For adult education, this is only reserved for teachers. So we don't support or we don't finance the mobility of adult people, but mainly of teachers. Now, my last point of the presentation is on the European Alliance for Apprenticeships. The economic crisis that broke up in 2008, 2009 has put a lot of pressure on VET systems as a way of responding to the challenges we have. The focus on work-based learning has been one of the main focus points, and of course the relevance of labor market skills has also come to the forefront, in the sense that we've seen that there's more than 6 million unemployed young people in Europe. And we have at the same time a curious situation in which there's almost 2 million vacancies that the companies cannot find the right skills. So this shows clearly when you have more than 6 million young people unemployed and you've got companies saying that they cannot find the right skills, there's clearly a problem of the link between the education system and what the labor market needs. And of course we are trying through various what we call skills intelligence schemes, a lot of them supported by CEDEFOP, our agency, as I told you. We're trying to identify how best we can make sure that the education system and the vocational education and training system in particular is capable of providing the skills that the labor market needs. My colleague will be speaking to you about the youth guarantee schemes, which basically what we want to do is to make sure that the young people, as soon as we identify that they are not in employment or not taking training, that we can in the first 4 months provide some kind of tools or some way of bringing them to either education or give them opportunity of employment. And of course we have the mobility program of having at least 6% benchmark, 6% of students in vocational education and training being mobile, so going from one country to the other, learning, having a learning experience outside their own country. To give you an idea of what are the participation rates of young people in Europe, you can see that in Europe we have a lot of diversity. We have some countries like Austria and the Czech Republic and Belgium with more than 70% of the students at upper secondary level attending vocational education and training programs. And we have countries like, for example, Cyprus and Hungary, where these numbers are below 20% or just above 20%. So you can see there's a lot of diversity in the vocational education training systems and also in the participation levels throughout Europe, and the average is 50%. So this means that for every 2 students in upper secondary school in Europe, one of them is attending a vocational education and training program, which is usually, unlike the American system that we listened to yesterday, which most of it is at tertiary level with the community colleges, although I know that you also have at upper secondary level, most of vocational education and training in Europe is done at upper secondary school level. Now, this graph shows you of these 50% that I told you that are attending vocational education and training, some countries have systems which are basically school-based, so without a lot of relation with the labor market. We have other systems which are basically almost work-based, in the sense that there's a lot of participation of the students in programs directly with companies. They either spend 3 days of each week at a company working, or in dual system like in Germany and Austria, or there's some other form. It might be you going once in a while to companies to work, or having laboratories in vocational education and training centers. But as you see, there's a very big variance in Europe of how much of the time spent by a student in vocational education and training is work-based or not. You see there's these extremes with Slovenia and Estonia with almost no work-based learning, and examples like Denmark and Germany where a very significant part is work-based learning. Another important element that we've identified recently is that there's a correlation. I mean, it's not the only explanation, of course, but there's a direct correlation that the more work-based learning you have in VET, the less likely it is for those young people to then become unemployed. And we have what we have. This graphic maybe is a little bit difficult to interpret. I'll just very briefly explain to you. What you have in the vertical columns is where youth unemployment rate is below 15%, the first column. The second column, 15 to 25, and the third, above 25% of youth unemployment. As you know, youth unemployment in Europe is a gigantic problem. It's more than double of what is the normal unemployment rate. We have countries in Europe like Spain and Greece where the youth unemployment is reaching unacceptable levels of around 50%. This means that in every 2 young people, 1 is unemployed. This is really a social drama that we have to handle. And what I was trying to say is that when you have vocational education and training programs that have a very strong work-based participation, like, for example, Denmark, Germany, and Austria, the unemployment level of the young people tend to be much lower. And you've got in the other extreme countries like Greece, Poland, Estonia, and even Spain, where the work-based learning is very, very small as part of the vocational education and training, where the unemployment rates are very, very high. Of course, this is not the only explanation, but this is a reality that you can detect in the ground. So the more you have work-based learning, the more it is unlikely that people will end up in unemployment. So this sort of explains why we've had this European Alliance for Apprenticeships and why it is so important. Because we believe that apprenticeship systems allow a smooth transition from education to work, because the students of vocational education and training have been exposed to a real work environment. It allows them to better understand how a company works and gives them better preparation for entering the labor market. The European Alliance for Apprenticeships, which is one of the big focus that we have right now for education and training and also employment policies, is is something that we came up jointly with DG Employment, and it was launched in 2013. It brought together a large group of stakeholders, so not only governments, VET providers, companies. We're trying to mobilize everyone to work for this, because it is impossible to think that only the governments can impose apprenticeships and it happens from one day to the other. There's a lot of stakeholder involvement that is necessary. It has been substantiated by a council, European Council declaration. Many member states have made pledges explaining what they will do to incentive and motivate apprenticeships in their countries. And in this regard, I'd like to congratulate the Basque country, because to my knowledge, it's the only region. So we have many member states with pledges for apprenticeships. The Basque country has gone a step further, and they themselves have come up with a pledge to support these apprenticeships. Not only that, I think we will be listening today to the Vice Minister of the Basque country speaking about the Education and Training 2015 of the Basque country, which is, I would say, a remarkable initiative, an example for the rest of Europe on how the Basque country is investing in vocational education and training. The aims of the Alliance are, of course, to reform the national vocational education training systems through apprenticeship schemes, increase the number of apprenticeships, the quality and its attractiveness, and of course ease the transition from education system to the labor market. And we believe that if we have good quality apprenticeship systems, if we are capable of showing society in general that vocational education and training is a means of the education sector to allow people to find jobs more easily, we'll also be increasing the attractiveness of VET, as you know, which is not the best. Usually, we still, a lot of countries, I wouldn't say all of them, because in Germany, for example, the VET system is regarded as top quality and equally as good as higher education. But in most countries of Europe, as you know, VET system is usually considered as sort of a social instrument, a social inclusion instrument, and a second choice. That, you know, if you cannot go to higher education, you go to vocational education and training. This is obviously wrong, because what we see is that in many countries, vocational education and training route is what allows people to get better jobs, quicker jobs, even in some cases, even better paid. But there's a sort of a mindset, a mental image that families and society in general have about education and training that we have to do a very big effort to improve. I'll just tell you how these are the last two slides, how we, for example, with Erasmus are supporting the apprenticeship systems. We've just launched a call in which we incentive organizations to work on apprenticeship systems, so create apprenticeship systems. And the first project duration, we'll have more calls in the next few years. We'll have one next year, but this first one is for project with a duration of up to 2 years. We give grants to participating entities of up to 300,000 euros. We co-finance the investments up to 75%. And the deadline for applications, if there's anyone interested, is up until the 26th of June. So you have still 3 or 4 weeks to apply for this first call for apprenticeships that we launched at the European level. What we want is to establish partnerships from experts from various member states aimed at policy reform, at creating pilot apprenticeship schemes, by establishing national business forums, and of course by creating dialogue throughout Europe on how best to set up apprenticeship systems. So I hope, you know, in these three ideas I wanted to pass to you, first of all, that at the European level we don't have the power to tell them we don't have the power and we don't have the expertise. I think it's very well done with the member states, but we do have a role at the European level to mobilize action and mobilize ideas, bring people together, bring the member states together to reform vocational education and training systems, that we have the financial means at the European level to support reforms in vocational education. We have Erasmus, we've got the European Social Fund, we've got other means, but these are the two most important. And lastly, that we are working with the member states in order to mobilize efforts to mainstream apprenticeship systems throughout Europe in the vocational education and training systems. Thank you very much for your attention.